Hi, my name is Ginny, also known as Two-Thirds Lotus, and this clip is part of my series analyzing the Essential Bukowski, edited by Abel DeBrito. Nothing has been edited out, so you're seeing this exactly as it was streamed on Twitch, with all the imperfections and tangents of a live stream. If you want to learn more or catch me live, make sure to check out the description, otherwise enjoy the incredible work of Charles Bukowski. So, we've done like 7 Bukowski poems. I have a YouTube playlist. It's like reading the Essential Bukowski. And 1, 2, 3, sort of the same analysis style that we would see on my, streams of reading my viewers' poems. Literally like the same thing, right? So that is what we're doing. I'm also trying to organize my stream view here a little bit. I'm kind of struggling with it right now because I need to be able to see OBS as well as Twitch and stuff. And I should be good at this, right? Because I've been streaming for a while now, but I still manage to be extremely disorganized. So let's just put that there. And then if I click OBS, it comes back. Okay, lovely. So more Bukowski, Destroying Beauty, Kick the Bankroll, Twins, which means we are on. Apologies, I didn't want to interrupt stream, thanks to the brave soul whom has started the conversation. I will be lurking in the background. Have a productive day, y'all. Yeah, of course. Oh, hello, a potato bun. Welcome. Absolutely. We love our lurkers here. And I'm glad that you will be able to do some productive stuff. If you are doing writing yourself, currently we're having an event on the Twitch writing community called Authtober, which maybe I just need to have the Twitch dashboard on here. Is something where we're collectively encouraging each other to write. We have this sort of goal of 1 million words collectively as a community, but it's not we're not pressuring people to do words, right? And you can join in by going on the Google Sheet too and putting in your own words if you're writing, and it can be anything. Poetry, prose, songwriting, homework, I don't really care. I think if you're writing along with us, that's all that matters, right? And you're never interrupting by chatting. I love having you all chat, and we're just getting started anyway. This one is nice and short, and that's good. It'll be nice to get back to, a poet considered very renowned. Bukowski is one of the probably most important or considered important American poets of recent time. So, and a lot of the things that he has written informed things afterward and inspired other amazing poets. So that being said, I'm going to analyze the whore who took my poems. And the process, for those who are new, is I believe it's important to just enjoy the poem first. Before you try to analyze, before you even pick up a pen. Even if it's for school, something you're being told to analyze, or if it's just something you're reading for fun, you should be analyzing that too. But reading the poem 3 times. Just to feel it, to hear it, to understand what the poet is saying. And then from there, you can begin to figure out what they're saying, figure out the nuance, the metaphor, the connections. And we go through all that together here. And if anyone has ideas on interpretation as we go, or their thoughts, or if we like or don't like the poem, that is something that is absolutely stuff that I want to hear. So, the whore who took my poems. Some say we should keep personal remorse from the poem, stay abstract, And there is some reason in this. But Jesus, 12 poems gone, and I don't keep carbons, and you have my paintings too, my best ones, it's stifling. Are you trying to crush me out like the rest of them? Why didn't you take my money? They usually do, from the sleeping drunken pants sick in the corner. Next time, take my left arm, or a 50, but not my poems. I'm not Shakespeare, but sometimes simply there won't be any more. Abstract or otherwise, there'll always be money and whores and drunkards down to the last bomb, but as God said, crossing his legs, I see where I've made plenty of poets, but not so much poetry. Bukowski the starving artist, as he shows himself more to be in every single poem we read of his. And we're going to read it again, because I stumbled, and it's nice to be able to read a poem through without having to, stumble over your own words. That really helps, feel the poem. Some say we should keep personal remorse from the poem. Stay abstract, and there is some reason in this. But Jesus, 12 poems gone, and I don't keep carbons, and you have my paintings too, my best ones. It's stifling. Are you trying to crush me out like the rest of them? Why didn't you take my money? They usually do, from the sleeping, drunken pants sick in the corner. Next time, take my left arm, or a 50, but not my poems. I'm not Shakespeare, but sometimes simply there won't be any more. Abstract or otherwise, there'll always be money and whores and drunkards down to the last bomb. But as God said, crossing his legs, I see where I've made plenty of poets, but not so very much poetry. So it feels like every time we read Bukowski, I put somewhere on the page, quotations, starving, or tortured artist. This is Bukowski, mastered this persona in a way that I haven't found anyone else to do, right? And this poem really leans into that once again. Bukowski talks about, in the case of The Day I Kicked a Bankroll Out the Window, how he was too in his head, sounding like a character from a play, being so obsessed with poetry and not money and real things, as the other person might have suggested, that she kicked him out. And he wrote about people like Hugo Wolf and Borodin, who he felt probably some relation to, and exaggerated them into other starving artists, other tortured artists. So Bukowski loves this, and it's fairly evident as a theme in this poem, right? The whore who, it's literally telling a story, which is nice. A lot of his poems are very, storytelling-like, which makes them easy to approach and read. And he's saying, I value my poems over everything else. Don't take my poems. Take a 50 instead. Take my left arm, right? And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. As much as we can, in fact. A lot more, probably. Some say we should keep personal remorse from the poem. Stay abstract. And there is some reason in this. But Jesus. I think the spelling's interesting there. 12 poems gone, and I don't keep carbons, and you have my paintings too, my best ones. It's stifling. Are you trying to crush me out like the rest of them? Why didn't you take my money, they usually do? From the sleeping drunk in pants, sick in the corner. Next time take my left arm or a 50, but not my poems. I'm not Shakespeare, but sometimes simply there won't be any more, abstract or otherwise. There will always be money and whores and drunkards down to the last bomb. But as God said, hello, drowning devil, we're reading Bukowski. As God said, crossing his legs, I see where I have made plenty of poets, but not so very much poetry. I feel as those modern relationships are gives and takes. Yeah, in reference to the poem, I think it's a very similar idea, that being that this relationship happens, it ends, there's a take, there's an amount of giving, transactionality, and in this case, this is a loss for Bukowski as a poem. And it's definitely a very valid point, and Bukowski was someone who spent a lot of time with whores and just the other sort of low life of society. And we've already read multiple poems on stream about that. It's just kind of his deal. He's a drunkard, he sleeps with prostitutes, he cheated on his first wife, maybe cheated on his second wife, I don't recall, wrote poems, drank, didn't make money, couldn't really care for his daughter and felt bad about that, so he drank and wrote poems and just tortured artist, right? So, I have underlined in blue a few things. Blue is normally my question color, right? And I don't know, so I've never heard the expression down to the last bomb, and I'm just curious as to if that has, I mean, like, it's fairly easy to infer here. We don't know what down to the last bomb means, but we can infer. This is a very useful term in analysis and writing, which maybe we can talk about. Inference. So if we don't know, right? If we don't know something, we can make an inference. And an inference is basically a best guess. And also what is useful in making an inference is context or context clues. Maybe some people know that phrase from school. I feel like I heard it a lot in school here in the States. Context clues, right? So I don't literally know what down to the last bomb means, but he's saying that poems are a limited resource, right? And that there will only be so many poems. I can only write so many poems. Poems take a lot of emotional ability to write. Poems are scarce, is what he says here. Scarcity. Now, when he talks about money and whores and drunkards, he's saying they are not scarce. Down to the last bomb. So, down to the last bomb, it sounds like, you know, a bomb, like violence, like the end of the world kind of deal. So it could be something like, even when everything else is gone, there will always be money, whores, and drunkards, but there won't always be poetry. Placing this just astronomical value on it. Right? And I find that interesting as well, because he talks about how God made plenty of poets, but not very much poetry. And this feels like just such a contradiction, as Bukowski really often writes about contradiction. Because there are many poets, and poets write lots of poetry, and no matter what, people will write poetry about things. And maybe there's more of a point to say that not all poets write poetry. That could be a potential interpretation here. Write poetry. And I say that because, right, I see where God said, I see where I have made plenty of poets, but not so very much poetry. So even though he has created lots of things that make poetry, for some reason there's not that much. And to me that's Bukowski pointing at other artists saying they are not poets, because he's also talking about what makes a poem valid in this poem. Some say we should keep personal remorse from the poem, stay abstract, and there is some reason in this. And perhaps a poem with these qualities, with personal remorse, is less of, or not a poet at all. Or not a poem, less of a poem. Or not poetry at all. And that makes the good poetry scarce, which is important as a tool in this narrative, because if Bukowski could just write more poetry or go buy a book of poetry, then it sort of gets rid of the point of him caring so much about it more than his left arm or a $50 bill. And I'm not certain I agree with Bukowski. I wrote these things in red. That's normally my criticism color, but Bukowski does write as usually an invitation to critique him. So I think. Right, we were talking about inference. So that being said, we can make the guess that, down to the last bomb is kind of just saying that when all things are gone, there will always be money and whores and drunkards, but this is perhaps adding to the idea of scarcity. That could be our inference here. If anyone knows or is familiar with the term down to the last bomb, let me know if you actually know what that means, or if anyone wants to look it up, because I just have never heard that used. And there's nothing wrong when reading something. It's very important. Nothing wrong when reading or when analyzing with looking up a word. Never heard that before. Yeah. Because reading is for your own personal gain, pleasure, understanding, all of that. And sometimes I've heard a sentiment that it almost feels like dumb to admit that you have to look up a word. But is it smarter to look up the word and appreciate the work more in depth? Or is it smarter to prop up an ego that says I didn't look it up? So that being said, down to the last bomb. To the last bomb. Idiom, perhaps. See, colloquially, bomb refers to something really good. But of course, these things have changed. Things can go down like a bomb. That's different than down to the last bomb. Down to the last bomb. And I think this is just Bukowski making up a saying, in a sense. Go down like a bomb. The bomb. Although the bomb existed in Bukowski's time. I infer it as the last nuclear bomb. Yeah, that was what I was maybe thinking as well. Talking about war and implying a sense of scarcity, because he did live in this time. And that's where inference, you can get context clues from the text, you can also get clues from wider context. Wider context. And yes, this was the Cold War, so the last bomb dropping would be the end of all things. When the war has ended, after all the bombs have been dropped, there will always be money, whores, and drunkards. It's to imply that they're not scarce, and we already sort of established that. I was just wondering if I could find a better understanding of the phrase, right? But again, that's why we had to infer and use our context, right? So all of that, and yet poetry is scarce, no matter what. Or sometimes there just isn't more poetry. It runs out. At least for a person, right? I exist within the bounds, the temporal bounds, constraints of my lifetime. And during that time, I only have so much mental energy and so much artistic, so much of a font of artistic inspiration inside of myself to create art. So you end up with a great value for that art you create if you're an artist, which Bukowski talks about. I just find it curious. Is suffering a requirement for poetry? No. There are no requirements for poetry, I would say. None at all. Suffering is a very powerful thing one can use in poetry, right? Bukowski uses it in basically every one of his poems. Shakespeare uses it in tragedies. You know, Romeo and Juliet. It's a play, but it's also poetic, right? There's sonnets in there, and it's tragic, and there's suffering. So there's that, right? However, there are many poets who write about much nicer things. Take Mary Oliver. I mention her a lot on stream. She writes about nature, and usually peace and beauty and things not nearly so tragic. And her poems are renowned and revered as, you know, she's one of the most incredible modern poets of recent time. She died, I think she died like in the last decade. So suffering is not a requirement for poetry. However, it kind of is a requirement for Bukowski's poetry. He was someone who wrote poetry on and about his suffering. He was the suffering, starving, tortured artist, and he makes sure we know that. So if you see like the name Bukowski, you can almost assume there's going to be suffering. But it's not. You could say that suffering as a concept might be required for poetry, in that without suffering, without pain, some people would argue that there's no relative benchmark for good emotions to have any value. From a more philosophical sense, if we do not suffer, how do we know what joy is? And poetry is tension of emotion and contradiction and feelings and all of those things. So there's an argument for sure to say suffering is a requirement for the existence of poetry. But suffering is certainly not required in poetry. Right? There is a brief ad break coming up. Please do not watch the ad. Stand up, look away from your screen, eat a snack, drink some water, take care of yourself, go to the bathroom. Don't open TikTok. Just take care of yourself for a moment. Ad breaks are for self-care on this channel, and I don't want you all allowing your time to be monetized in that way, even though I sort of do the same thing. Contradiction. But enjoy your self-care ad break. We'll stand up. Welcome back. Looks like ads are over, but I have multiple screens that always tell me different times for the ads. I catch your drift. Thanks for clearing that up. Musicians alike take advantage of breakups, although it can be negative. Yeah. Taylor Swift writes a great deal about suffering in her many breakups, or breakup songs, or more dramatic writing about suffering. Let's take Nirvana, not founders, but seminal grunge band, writing about mental illness and really topical social issues, suffering, right? And, or even classical music or jazz. I was once a musician. I perhaps still am. And that absolutely takes the tension between things that are discordant, suffering, and things that are pleasant sounding and tonal. And it is in that balance that we make the tension and release that is music. Right. So as for the rest of this poem, forgot I've been gifting a sub. I was waiting for the ad and never came. Well, you can stand up before the ad break starts. If I'm telling you there's an ad break, it means I think there will be one, and I'm going to stand up for a minute and a half. But yeah, it was so crazy yesterday being rated by like 400, like a channel of like 400 viewers. My mind broke when that happened. So, some say we should keep personal remorse from the poem. Stay abstract, and there is some reason in this, but Jesus, 12 poems gone, and I don't keep carbons, and you have my paintings too, my best ones. It's stifling. It was crazy you did well with all those eyes on you. Thank you. I'm glad you think I kept it together. Yep. It was the second half of stream. I got rated by channel to Chart Games, and they were talking about poetry on the end of their stream and rated out to me because I'm like the only person who streams poetry exclusively on Twitch. So when you look up poetry, if I'm live, you like find me. At least in English, I don't know. And apparently they did that and stumbled upon my channel, rating out, and got like 11 subs. It was crazy. It's crazy. Super thankful. So we talk about Bukowski and his contradiction and his constant whining about his life as a starving artist. And that's why I'm hesitant to exactly like feel bad for Bukowski in this poem. Of course, I would feel pretty bad if 12 of my poems were gone, and his best paintings too. You know, I don't keep carbons, although I do have a lot of mine on the internet. But if I lost, you know, one of my notebooks, I would lose a lot of poetry. If some person took it. But he also says, like, it's extremely ironic. Are you trying to crush me out like the rest of them? Why didn't you take my money like they usually do? From the sleeping drunken pants, sick in the corner. This isn't an uncommon occurrence. Like, this is kind of on Bukowski. Of course, someone taking your stuff isn't really your fault. But if there's anyone I'm going to like blame for their bad actions, it's Bukowski, because all he did was drink and sleep with whores and be a sort of bad parent to his daughter and husband to his wives. And I feel like in particular that I care about pointing out the contradiction in this poem because of how it ends. But as God said, crossing his legs, I see where I have made plenty of poets, but not very much poetry. Yeah, I'm not a fan of Bukowski at all. I am a huge fan of Bukowski. His poetry is incredible. I am a huge not fan of Bukowski as a person. But not so very much poetry. And this to me kind of says, I think this is leaning into the idea of discounting or devaluing the work of other poets, which I don't like. I mean, basically nothing he says is things I agree with. Actually, there's a lot of things he says that I agree with, but not this. Because he opens the poem and closes the poem by talking about what makes certain poems valuable as poetry. And then shows himself claiming he values his own poems. Bukowski says, you know, take my left arm but not my poems. He says, I value these, but then, of course, displays the irony of him not valuing his own work. Usually do. This has happened before, right? And that leads me to the conclusion that he is, as he often is, and maybe this would help you enjoy Bukowski more, a potato bun, he is displaying himself as someone to be critiqued. He knows he is playing into this starving artist, tortured artist role. He talks about it even in the previous poem, which we can look back on, and I can show you some more of these examples, that he knows he's an awful person. And his poetry is very self-analytical. And then, of course, he doesn't change because he's Bukowski, and he's like this degenerate. But he allows us to look at him and say, look at this guy. who talks about other poets not writing poetry of value, or just that poetry is such a valuable thing, and then turns around, shows himself not valuing his own work. This is the constant theme that we find in Bukowski of self-contradiction. And I think he does this very often in a really impressive way. Contradiction. Because he shows us what on first glance looks like Charles Bukowski whining about the whore who took his poems. And a lot of his poems kind of read as whining about his plight that he's put himself into. But if you spin it, Bukowski was an artist. I think he knows that he's giving us a poem, or knew that he was giving us a poem, allowing us to critique him. It's the idea of the unreliable narrator and dramatic irony, which I think he leans into just enough and does just enough of the contradiction to allow the person who digs into his sort of silly claims to realize that he knows it too. He talks about in the previous poem, or not the previous poem, 2 poems ago in this book. Literary analysis wasn't on my bingo card, but it seems fun. Yeah. Welcome the Spooksy. That's my older sibling. I'm glad you're here. So in this previous poem, a couple poems ago in this book, and this is the Essential Bukowski, for anyone wondering. Get out, you've thrown your last tantrum. I'm tired of your damn tantrums. You're always acting like a character in an O'Neill play. And this was a playwright who wrote about, like, downtrodden, overly exaggerated characters in his plays. So this was also called The Day I Kicked a Bankroll Out the Window, about a different whore kicking him out when he was being obnoxious and whiny because he's kind of a brat. Brat? So that being said, Bukowski describes himself literally as a caricature. And he plays into it every single time. Not every time in his art, but, you know, people sometimes talk about not analyzing the person, the writer, based on their work. But I always find myself falling into it, and I don't really think it's a problematic thing to do if you spend enough time with the work. Because we've spent 45 minutes on Bukowski on a poem that is very short. This is probably 40 words or something. Charlie XCX would like a word. Yeah, I don't think she would describe Bukowski as brat-pilled, or I don't think she would like Bukowski as a person, and I don't think Bukowski would like Charlie XCX. So, because she's successful. Oops. Charlie XCX, I didn't mean to add the E, that's not part of it, is not the starving artist. She is successful, in some sense, corporate. I feel like Bukowski would be one of the people who very obnoxiously goes out of his way in the modern time to, like, slam, like, pop musicians. I personally really enjoy her music and enjoy pop and also, like, the underground indie stuff and everything that's charting and everything that's not. So I don't find fame to be a contributor to the value of one's work. Of course, good work often, really good work, not often, sometimes gets famous. Right? So I always say that we should be critiquing the things we read. Whenever you read someone's work, if it's a friend, if it's a published poet, you should be, at least in your head, doing some amount of critique. Why do I say this? because critique helps us find the things we like and the things we don't like. Critique isn't just about the other person. Critique is a powerful lesson for yourself. And that's why I can have so much fun and just do it, what seems like near endlessly, literary analysis, on stream, because it teaches me to be a better artist. And I find it really hard with Bukowski, because, as I said earlier to a potato bun, I really, really like Bukowski. And that makes it hard to find things that I don't like if I feel he very effectively describes the things that he's trying to do and say. But it can be useful now that I've done like an analysis of what he's talking about as a broader theme, or what I feel like the broad theme is. This is a time where it can be useful to go back and read the initial, or read the whole poem like we did initially, because that can just help you go through every line again, hear them, and be like, oh, well, maybe this isn't actually serving the meaning that I pulled from this poem, in which case that's a critique I would have for Bukowski. I would tell him, don't include this line. I don't think it serves your message. So, that being said, I need to stop saying that being said. I say it a lot. To the whore who took my poems. Some say we should keep personal remorse from the poem. Stay abstracts, and there is some reason to this. But Jesus, 12 poems gone, and I don't keep carbons, and you have my paintings too. My best ones. It's stifling. Are you trying to crush me out like the rest of them? Why didn't you take my money? They usually do, from the sleeping, drunken pants in the corner, sick in the corner. Next time, take my left arm or a 50, but not my poems. I'm not Shakespeare. But sometimes simply there won't be any more. Abstract or otherwise, there'll always be money and whores and drunkards down to the last bomb. But as God said, crossing his legs, I see where I have made plenty of poets, but not so very much poetry. Would Bukowski survive in a world of plagiarism? I don't know if Bukowski would survive in a world with, like, vapes. You know? Like, I would be more worried about Bukowski having Tinder and vaping and like, I don't know. But would Bukowski survive in a world of plagiarism? That's a really interesting question. Because I do think our world is more prone to plagiarism. You see people just lift things from online and say, like, yeah, this is going to be mine now. And, oh, I don't know, Bukowski on X, on Twitter, that could be dubious too. I want to make like a parody Twitter account that's just Charles Bukowski. I just complain about all of my life's problems as if I was Bukowski. Bukowski is a type of person who'd fall for a telephone/internet scam, lose his life savings, and write a poem bitching about it. Yes, that's Bukowski. I would like to address the world of plagiarism comment, though. I think it's really interesting. Because, yeah, plagiarism is super way more common now. It's super way more easier. We see it, I mean, it's just the internet. Like, high-level academics are just plagiarizing. Granted, people have always plagiarized, just in different ways. People would plagiarize by not crediting, like, women. That happened in science for a long time. But I think I find this a hard question to answer personally because I have very non-traditional views on plagiarism in that I generally don't care. I don't care if people plagiarize my work. I have it in my like bio on X. I say literally like steal this art. It stopped being mine as soon as I put it on the internet. And maybe Bukowski would also realize that and just not post his things on the internet. But I feel like it might just give Bukowski more fuel. He would post something on the internet, have it be stolen, and then write 10 more poems because he was angry and bitch about it. And then he'd be all the better. I also wonder, I think the best way to survive in a world of plagiarism is to make work that is not plagiarizable, that is unique, that is so clearly and undeniably yours that to steal it is obvious. I feel that way about Bukowski. I feel that way about Mary Oliver. I'm sure people tried to plagiarize Mary Oliver. I'm sure people tried to take her ideas, rewrite poems, and put them into their own work. But there is something so special about the way Mary Oliver constructs a poem about nature. And I think there's something very special about the way Bukowski makes a poem bitching about his problems. Right? So, would he survive? Probably. Bukowski seems like the kind of person who would survive no matter what, because again, he would be on Tinder, he would like sleep with people, he'd like woo them as this artist who was like sad and mysterious, and then they'd kick him out 2 weeks later, and he would just be doing all of this, like, but posting it all on the internet, and I think that would be hilarious. I think Bukowski in our age would be such a character, right? But I think the people who don't survive in the world of plagiarism are who doesn't survive? Partially the ones who can't, like, beat it. If other people can make work that sounds like you, then it doesn't really matter if people plagiarize because your work isn't unique. I feel like if I tried to write this poem myself, plagiarize it essentially, take his ideas, take his work, I would fail miserably. Because it's Bukowski and he has a voice. It's like, I mean, there are just so many artists like that, right? Bukowski would also survive down to the last bomb. Bukowski would find an alleyway to lay in and, like, find a way to get a bottle of alcohol into his hand and find a bed to sleep in with someone who shouldn't be sleeping with him. So he seems like the kind of person who would always survive. He would survive differently. He'd be terrifying. If anyone wants to take the idea and make a Charles Bukowski Twitter account, absolutely do it. Plagiarize that. Or I'll do it myself. Because it'd be really freaking funny. My best friend, the person who, not my best friend, my best poetry friend, the person who got me into poetry, my friend Stella, is the one who recommended Bukowski to me. And it would be sort of funny if it came full circle and I decided to, like, do this Bukowski. I think I'm the one meant for the Charles Bukowski account. Okay. I think I'm gonna do it. It sounds super fun. It'll be real Charles Bukowski. It'll be great. Charles Bukowski is on X. We're gonna do it. Maybe I'll do that tonight. I'm gonna have so much fun with it, y'all. So, I was thinking about how I would critique this poem and how I would tell Charles Bukowski to do it better. And I think I read over it. Or I got like halfway through. Got head out. Thanks for the education and giggles. Thank you for... You inspired the Charles Bukowski conversation, the modern age. Thank you for joining in. Thank you for hanging out. I appreciate your being here. Have a wonderful, whatever time zone it is. Have a poetic day. All of those things, right? Can't get over it. How would I do this poem better, though, if we're critiquing? Now that we talked about how I don't feel like I can match Bukowski in the way that he writes about the things he writes about, but I could give Bukowski advice. Some say we should keep personal remorse in the poem, stay abstract, and there is some reason in this. But Jesus, 12 poems gone and I don't keep carbons, and you have my paintings too, my best ones, it's stifling. Like, that's excellent poetic whining. Are you trying to crush me out like the rest of them? Why didn't you take my money? They usually do from the sleeping drunken pants sick in the corner. Good context. He describes the pants really well. It's like a cool poetic line. Why didn't you take my money? They usually do. Like, all of these lines are fairly operative in what I feel like he's saying. So we don't have critique for them, necessarily. Next time, take my left arm or a 50, but not my poems. I'm not Shakespeare, but sometimes simply, there won't be any more, abstract or otherwise. There'll always be money and whores and drunkards, down to the last bomb. But as God said, crossing his legs, I see where I have made plenty of poets, but not so very much poetry. Okay, let's say I was going to critique Charles Bukowski here. The line I would decide to point at, based on what we've talked about, is I'm not Shakespeare. Because this is him devaluing his own poems. When I said that his message in this is maybe to value his poems in an ironic way based on the way he also treats them and treats himself, and ends up allowing them to be stolen by a whore multiple times. But then he says, I'm not Shakespeare. And I think one could increase the degree of irony by having Bukowski describe himself as maybe just being a little less self-deprecating and being more whiny about how these were amazing poems that were taken. Because, right, my best ones, it's stifling. Like, he does really like these poems. Of course, one could also argue with that criticism that he's Bukowski and that's what he does. If Bukowski wasn't self-deprecating at some point in a poem, again, I don't think it would be a Bukowski poem. It'd be like, oh, plagiarism. He doesn't self-deprecate. But that is a potential, like, point that slightly compromises what I feel is a great sort of message. But sometimes simply there won't be any more, abstract or otherwise. There'll always be more money and whores and drunkards down to the last bomb. But as God said, crossing his legs, I see where I have made plenty of poets, but not so very much poetry. like, sometimes you read published poetry and you're like, okay, this is fine, but I feel like I could write this. Sometimes I read Chatter's poetry and I am able to give a lot of advice because a lot of us are beginners, and that's an awesome thing. I can give my own poetry critique because I'm really not that experienced. I'm not an incredible poet yet. But when I read Bukowski, sometimes I feel like there's only 1 or 2 lines I can critique. And even then I have to hedge it and say, well, there's other reasons why I like this line. That being said, as long as you're doing some critique of everything you're reading, I think you're doing it right. So that's pretty much all I have for the whore who took my poems, unless anyone else has questions or things you want to point out with the poem that could spark more wonderful tangents and conversations. Images of Bukowski vaping. I could get like AI, tell it to make art of Bukowski's Tinder profile. I could just make a Tinder profile. Oh my gosh, we're cooking. If anyone's in the Las Vegas area, Charles Bukowski is in the dating market. But if nothing else is said, I will read it one more time, and that will be to the whore who took my poems. Can't wait to see the Tinder profile. Oh yeah. Some say we should keep personal remorse from the poem. Sorry, I'm thinking about the Charles Bukowski Tinder profile, and I'm having so many good ideas. I need to get Tinder Worldwide. Welcome, Stylish Fail. I don't know if you were here earlier for the conversation about Charles Bukowski in the modern world, and we talked about him being on Tinder and vaping and how awful. We're reading Bukowski. And I'm saying that I am going to make a Tinder profile and like other social media as Charles Bukowski and have him poetically whine on social media as if he were alive. All of his same poetic whining that he does. Yeah, it's going to be super fun. We have a few minutes before the ad break, so I'm going to read this, and that will be the end of the analysis of To the Whore Who Took My Poems, if I can keep myself from cracking up. Someday, we should keep Great at reading. Some say we should keep personal remorse from the poem. Stay abstract, and there is some reason to this. But, Jesus, 12 poems gone? And I don't keep carbons. And you have my paintings too, my best ones. It's stifling. Are you trying to crush me out like the rest of them? Why didn't you take my money? They usually do. From the sleeping drunken pants, sick in the corner. Next time, take my left arm or a 50, but not my poems. I'm not Shakespeare. But sometimes, simply, there won't be any more, abstract or otherwise. There'll always be money and whores and drunkards down to the last bomb. But as God said, crossing his legs, I see where I have made plenty of poets, but not so very much poetry. Thank you all for indulging my reading of Charles Bukowski and our analysis. I think this was a super fun one. And stay tuned for Charles Bukowski Official on X and many screenshots of Charles Bukowski telling you about how he just discovered Tinder and vaping and other such things, which I hope to have him incessantly whine about on the internet. We now have a self-care ad break. Please stand up. Thanks for listening to me and my thoughts on Bukowski. Make sure to check out the rest of the series if you enjoyed, and follow or stop by Twitch if you want to see more. See you there.